The DNA report trembled in my hands as I stared at the impossible words printed across the sterile white paper. Lisa Grant, the 16-year-old girl who had been coming to my bakery every Tuesday for months, ordering the same chocolate croissant and asking about my day with genuine interest, wasn't just a sweet customer. She was my daughter. The daughter I had mourned for 15 years. The daughter Pinewood General Hospital told me had died during a complicated delivery on a rainy October night in 2009. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I watched through the window as Lisa walked away from my shop, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sunlight in exactly the same way mine did at her age. The way she tilted her head when thinking, the small scar on her left hand, from what I now knew wasn't a childhood accident, but a birthmark I had kissed 1,000 times in my dreams. It all made devastating sense. My name is Rachel Thompson, and what I'm about to tell you will shake your faith in the medical system, in authority, and in the very foundations of trust we build our lives upon. For 15 years, I lived with the unbearable weight of losing a child. I decorated a nursery that was never used, celebrated birthdays for a daughter who wasn't there, and carried guilt that nearly destroyed my marriage and my sanity. But the truth was far more sinister than a medical tragedy. The truth was that my baby never died at all. The story begins where most nightmares do, in a place that should have been safe. Pinewood General Hospital sat like a fortress on the hill, overlooking our small town of Clearwater Heights. Its imposing brick facade and gleaming windows promising healing and hope. I had driven past it countless times during my pregnancy, never imagining that behind those pristine walls, a conspiracy was unfolding that would steal not just my child but my very identity as a mother. David and I had been married for 3 years when we decided to start a family. He was a high school teacher with dreams of becoming a principal, and I had just opened my bakery, Sweet Beginnings, on Main Street. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. The tiny apartment above the bakery smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls, and we spent our evenings planning for the family we desperately wanted. The pregnancy had been textbook perfect until the final month. Dr. Patricia Morse, the chief of obstetrics at Pinewood General, monitored my care with what I thought was exceptional attention. She was in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to calculate rather than comfort. During my appointments, she would study my charts with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, but I attributed it to thoroughness. Looking back now, I realize she wasn't studying my medical history. She was evaluating my worth as a target. The contractions started on a Tuesday evening in October. David rushed me to the hospital through sheets of rain that seemed to hammer the windshield with the same intensity as my labor pains. The emergency room at Pinewood General was surprisingly quiet for a Tuesday night, staffed by faces I didn't recognize despite living in Clearwater Heights my entire life. Labor progressed normally for the first 6 hours. David held my hand, counted through contractions, and whispered reassurances that everything would be perfect. The nurses, led by a woman whose nameplate read Sandra Mills, moved around us with practiced efficiency. Sandra was younger than the others, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes that seemed genuinely concerned for my comfort. She was the only staff member who looked at me like I was a person rather than a medical case. Everything changed during the transition phase. Dr. Morse appeared suddenly, her usual calculating expression replaced by something that seemed almost predatory. She examined me quickly, then announced that complications were developing rapidly. The baby's heart rate was dropping, she said, and immediate intervention was necessary. "We need to take you to surgery now," Dr. Morse declared, her voice cutting through my exhaustion. "The cord is wrapped around the baby's neck, and we're seeing signs of distress." David tried to follow as they wheeled me down the hallway, but Dr. Morse stopped him with a firm hand. "Family members wait here," she said, gesturing to a small room with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines. "We'll update you as soon as we can." I remember the operating room being colder than I expected, the bright lights creating harsh shadows on the ceiling tiles I stared at while they administered the anesthesia. Dr. Morse's face appeared above me, her expression unreadable behind her surgical mask. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was her saying something to another doctor about the Grant situation and making sure everything matches the timeline. At the time, groggy from medication and terrified for my baby's safety, I didn't register the significance of those words. Now, they haunt every quiet moment of my life. I woke up to David's tear-stained face and the most devastating news a mother can hear. Dr. Morse stood at the foot of my hospital bed, her expression appropriately somber, and delivered the words that would define the next 15 years of my existence. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of professional sympathy. "We did everything we could, but the cord compression was too severe. Your daughter didn't survive the delivery." The world collapsed around me in that moment. David's hand gripped mine as sobs shook my entire body, but even through the grief, something felt wrong. I had been conscious enough during the early stages of labor to feel the baby moving, responding to voices, seemingly healthy and strong. The sudden decline Dr. Morse described seemed almost impossibly rapid. "I want to see her," I whispered through my tears. Dr. Morse exchanged a glance with the nurse beside her, a look I would later recognize as coordination rather than sympathy. "The delivery was traumatic, Rachel. For your emotional well-being, I would strongly advise against viewing the baby right now. Sometimes it's better to remember the pregnancy, the hope, rather than—" "I want to see my daughter," I repeated, finding strength in my voice despite the devastating news. What followed was a series of delays, complications, and explanations that should have raised immediate red flags. The baby needed to be prepared for viewing, they said. Hospital protocol required certain procedures. Dr. Morse recommended waiting until the next day when I would be more emotionally stable. Each delay came with reasonable-sounding medical justifications that masked what I now know was frantic coordination to maintain their deception. When I finally saw what they claimed was my baby 24 hours later, something fundamental felt wrong. The tiny form was wrapped completely in hospital blankets, with only a peaceful face visible. I was allowed to hold the bundle for exactly 10 minutes under the close supervision of 2 nurses who seemed more focused on my reactions than my grief. The baby was cold, perfectly still, and something about the size seemed different than what I remembered from my pregnancy measurements. But grief has a way of distorting perception, and I dismissed my concerns as the desperate denial of a heartbroken mother. Dr. Morse assured me that shock and medication could affect memory and perception. The hospital staff surrounded David and me with sympathy and support, helping us arrange for burial services and connecting us with grief counselors who specialized in infant loss. The funeral was small and heartbreaking. We buried what I believed was my daughter in Mountain View Cemetery under a tiny white headstone that read, "Baby Thompson, beloved daughter gone too soon." I planted a small rose bush beside the grave and visited every week for the first year, then monthly for the next several years, and at least on her birthday and holidays ever since. The grief counseling helped somewhat, but the loss created a chasm in my marriage that we struggled to bridge. David threw himself into his teaching career and eventually achieved his dream of becoming a principal. But our conversations about having more children always ended in painful silence. I channeled my maternal instincts into my bakery, treating my regular customers like an extended family and finding purpose in feeding the community. Life moved forward because it had to, but the missing piece never stopped aching. The first crack in the carefully constructed lie appeared 12 years later, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Sandra Mills, the nurse who had been present during my labor, appeared at my bakery on a busy Saturday morning. She looked older, more worn, with deep circles under her eyes and hands that shook slightly as she ordered coffee. "You probably don't remember me," she began hesitantly, "but I was one of the nurses when you delivered at Pinewood General." Quote, "The mention of that night sent a familiar stab of pain through my chest. But I managed a polite smile. Of course, Sandra. You were very kind during a difficult time." She stood at the counter for several long moments, seeming to wrestle with something internal. Finally, she spoke words that should have changed everything, but that I was too protective of my own fragile peace to fully hear. "Rachel, I want you to know that I've always wondered about that night. There were things that didn't seem right. Procedures that weren't standard. I've carried questions for years, and I just wanted to say that if you ever needed someone to talk to about what happened, someone who was there, I would be willing to listen. At the time, I interpreted her offer as the kindness of a healthcare worker who had witnessed my trauma and wanted to help with ongoing grief. I thanked her warmly and said that I was managing well with my counseling and support systems. Sandra nodded, but her expression remained troubled as she left my bakery that day. I didn't realize until much later that Sandra had been trying to find the courage to tell me the truth. She had been carrying her own burden of knowledge for 12 years, watching me grieve for a child who was not only alive but living just 20 minutes away in the working-class neighborhood of Riverside. The second crack appeared 3 years later in the form of a teenage girl with auburn hair and green eyes who reminded me painfully of my own adolescence. Lisa Grant started visiting my bakery during her lunch breaks from Riverside High School. Always polite, always ordering the same chocolate croissant, always paying with exact change from a small wallet that looked like it had seen better days. "Mrs. Thompson?" she would say. "Could I have my usual, please?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her voice carried a slight accent that wasn't quite local, and her mannerisms were oddly formal for a teenager. Over time, Lisa began staying longer during her visits, asking about my day, complimenting new pastries, and showing genuine interest in the history of my bakery. She told me she was working part-time at a grocery store to help her adoptive parents with expenses and saving money for college. Her adoptive parents, she explained, were older and had taken her in when she was an infant through a private arrangement. "I don't know much about my birth parents," she mentioned one afternoon while helping me arrange a display of cupcakes. "My parents said it was a difficult situation, and they thought it was better for everyone if I didn't know the details." Something in her wistful tone and the way she touched her auburn hair when she spoke about her origins made my chest tighten with familiar grief. I found myself looking forward to her visits and worrying about her when she didn't appear for several days. David noticed my attachment to the teenager and gently expressed concern that I might be projecting my maternal grief onto a customer who simply needed a safe adult to talk to. He was probably right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa and I shared some inexplicable connection that went beyond baker and customer. The third crack, the one that would eventually shatter everything, came on Lisa's 16th birthday. She appeared at my bakery after school looking subdued rather than celebratory. When I asked about her birthday plans, she shrugged and said her parents were working and they would probably have cake that weekend. On impulse, I decorated one of my specialty chocolate cakes with "Happy Birthday, Lisa" in her favorite purple frosting and refused to let her pay for it. As she hugged me goodbye that day, something about the gesture felt profoundly right in a way I couldn't explain. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she said, tears in her green eyes. "You've been more of a mother to me than you probably realize." Her words stayed with me for weeks, echoing during quiet moments in the bakery and keeping me awake at night. There was something about Lisa Grant that called to the empty place in my heart where my daughter should have been, but I dismissed it as the natural affection between a childless woman and a motherless girl who had found comfort in each other. It wasn't until the following spring, when Lisa mentioned that she had been born at Pinewood General Hospital on October 15, 2009, that the impossible began to seem possible. October 15th was the day my daughter was born. October 15th was the day my daughter died. October 15th was the day that Dr. Patricia Morris told me I would never hold my baby girl in my arms. But there I was, looking at a 16-year-old girl with my eyes, my hair color, my stubborn chin, who had been born on the exact same day at the exact same hospital where I had lost everything that mattered. The rational part of my mind insisted it was an incredible coincidence, a cruel trick of fate that had brought this girl into my life to reopen old wounds. But the maternal instinct that had never stopped aching for my lost daughter whispered a different possibility, one so devastating and hopeful that I couldn't allow myself to believe it without proof. That night, I sat in my kitchen with David and told him about Lisa's birthday, about the hospital, about the impossible timing. He listened with the patience of a man who had watched his wife grieve for 15 years, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Rachel," he said gently, "you know what this sounds like, don't you? This is the kind of thinking that Dr. Martinez warned us about in counseling. Sometimes our minds create connections where none exist, because the alternative is too painful to accept." He was right, of course. Dr. Martinez had warned us about the ways grief could distort reality, create false hope, and prevent healing. Every rational thought I possessed agreed with David's assessment. But standing in my kitchen, holding a photo of Lisa that she had given me to put on my customer appreciation board, I couldn't ignore the evidence of my own eyes. The girl in the photograph wasn't just similar to my baby photos. She was identical to them. That weekend, I drove to Mountain View Cemetery and sat beside the small white headstone that marked my daughter's grave. The rosebush I had planted 15 years ago was in full bloom, its pink flowers a reminder of all the birthdays and milestones I had marked in this place. "I don't know what to think," I whispered to the headstone. "I don't know what to hope for or what to fear, but I need to know the truth, baby girl. I need to know if you're really here with me or if you're really here with you." The silence of the cemetery offered no answers. But as I sat in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the graves of strangers, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out the truth about Lisa Grant, no matter how impossible it seemed or how much it might hurt. I had no idea that the truth would be more devastating than anything I had imagined, or that discovering it would expose a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of families and corrupted the very institution I had trusted with the most precious moment of my life. The investigation I was about to begin would reveal that my daughter had never died at all. She had been stolen from me by people I had trusted, sold to the highest bidder, and raised by strangers while I mourned her death for 15 years. But even that shocking truth was only the beginning of a much darker story, one that would ultimately expose Pinewood General Hospital's most guarded secret, and the monster who had orchestrated it all. As I drove home from the cemetery that evening, Lisa Grant was finishing her homework at a kitchen table 20 minutes away, completely unaware that the woman who had been buying her chocolate croissants and celebrating her birthday was actually the mother who had never stopped loving her. Tomorrow, everything would change for both of us. The DNA test kit arrived on a Wednesday morning, hidden inside a plain brown envelope that I signed for with trembling hands. For 3 sleepless nights, I had debated whether to go through with it, whether to risk everything I had built on the possibility that my instincts were right. David had left early for a district meeting, giving me the privacy I needed to collect the samples that would either confirm my wild theory or prove that grief had finally driven me beyond reason. Lisa's hair strand came from the sweater she had forgotten at the bakery the previous week. As I carefully placed it in the provided envelope, I noticed my hands were steady for the first time in days. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was determination. My own sample was easier to collect, though the implications made my stomach churn. If the test came back positive, it would mean that 15 years of grief had been manufactured, that the tiny grave I visited at Mountain View Cemetery was empty, that every tear I had shed over my lost daughter had been based on a lie so profound it defied comprehension. The waiting period stretched endlessly. 10 business days, the laboratory promised, but each hour felt like a lifetime. I continued my routine at the bakery, smiled at customers, chatted about the weather, and tried to ignore the way my heart raced every time I saw Lisa's auburn hair through the front window. She had been coming in more frequently, sometimes twice a day, always with that same gentle smile and genuine interest in my well-being. During one afternoon visit, she mentioned that her adoptive parents, Carol and Frank Grant, had been arguing more lately about money and her college plans. "Mom thinks I should go to community college and live at home," Lisa said, absently breaking her chocolate croissant into small pieces. "Dad wants me to apply to state schools, but they're worried about the cost. Sometimes I feel like such a burden to them." The pain in her voice made my chest tighten. Here was a girl who should have been planning her future with the confidence of a child who knew she was deeply wanted and supported. Instead, she was carrying the weight of being grateful for basic care, of feeling like an obligation rather than a blessing. "You're not a burden," I said firmly, perhaps more intensely than the situation warranted. "Any parent would be lucky to have a daughter like you." Lisa looked up at me with those green eyes that mirrored my own, and for a moment I saw something pass across her expression. Recognition, maybe, or the same inexplicable connection I felt every time she walked into my shop. "Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" My throat constricted. but I nodded. Did you ever have children? You always seem so understanding about family stuff, like you really get what it's like to be a kid who needs support. The question hit me like a physical blow. How do you explain to a 16-year-old girl that you had a daughter once? A daughter who would be exactly her age. A daughter who died before you could hold her, or tell her how much she was loved. I had a baby once, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't survive. Lisa's expression crumpled with sympathy. I'm so sorry. That must be incredibly painful. It is, I admitted, but talking with you, spending time with someone your age, it helps me imagine what she might have been like. What I didn't say was that I wasn't imagining anymore. I was looking directly at what she might have been like, what she was, if my impossible theory proved correct. The call came on a Friday afternoon while I was closing the bakery. The number on my phone matched the laboratory's contact information, and my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the device before answering. Mrs. Thompson, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Precision Genetics Laboratory. I'm calling with the results of your paternity test. The world seemed to stop moving. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through my bakery windows, the distant sound of traffic on Main Street, even my own breathing seemed suspended, as I waited for words that would either destroy or rebuild my entire understanding of reality. The results show a 97% probability that you are the biological mother of the tested subject. Mrs. Thompson, are you still there? The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the flour-dusted counter. 15 years of grief, 15 years of visiting an empty grave, 15 years of believing my daughter was dead, collapsed around me in a single moment of devastating clarity. Lisa Grant was my daughter. My baby girl was alive. I sank to the floor of my bakery, surrounded by the ovens and mixing bowls that had become my sanctuary, and sobbed with an intensity that shook my entire body. These weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of rage, of relief, of overwhelming joy, and of a fury so pure it threatened to consume everything in its path. Someone had stolen my child. Someone had looked me in the eye 15 years ago while I begged to see my baby, had handed me a bundle that wasn't her, had watched me bury an empty coffin while my living daughter was being raised by strangers 20 minutes away. The realization that followed was even more devastating. Lisa had been visiting my bakery for months, drawn to me by instincts she couldn't understand, seeking the maternal connection that had been severed by lies and manipulation. She had been coming to me for the love and support she should have been receiving at home, not knowing that home was exactly where she belonged. I called David from the bakery floor, still clutching the phone with shaking hands. When he answered, his cheerful, "Hey, honey," broke something inside me that I hadn't even realized was still intact. "David," I whispered, "you need to come to the bakery right now. Don't ask questions, just come. Our daughter is alive." The silence that followed stretched for several heartbeats before David's voice came back, careful and concerned. "Rachel, what's happening? Are you having another episode? Do you need me to call Dr. Martinez?" "I'm not having an episode," I said, finding strength in my voice as the initial shock began to crystallize into determination. "I had a DNA test done. Lisa Grant is our daughter. The baby we buried isn't her. Our little girl is alive, David. She's been alive this whole time." Another pause, then David's voice, strained with 15 years of watching me grieve. "I'm coming. Don't do anything, don't call anyone, just wait for me." He arrived within minutes, still wearing his suit from the district meeting, his principal's badge clipped to his jacket pocket. I showed him the DNA results, watched his face transform from skeptical concern to shocked comprehension to the same raw fury that was building in my chest. "How is this possible?" he asked, reading the laboratory report for the third time. "How does a hospital fake a baby's death? How does a child end up adopted by people across town without anyone questioning the circumstances?" Those were exactly the questions I intended to find answers to, but first, we had to figure out how to approach Lisa. She had no idea that the woman who had been giving her free pastries and birthday cakes was actually her biological mother. She believed her birth parents had given her up willingly, that her adoptive parents had rescued her from an unwanted situation. The truth was going to shatter her world as completely as it had shattered ours. David and I spent the weekend researching everything we could find about Lisa's adoptive family. Carol and Frank Grant had been in their 40s when they adopted Lisa as an infant. Frank worked as a mechanic at a shop in Riverside, and Carol cleaned houses for wealthy families in Clearwater Heights. They were decent people, by all accounts, but they struggled financially and had never been able to provide Lisa with the opportunities or attention she deserved. More disturbing was what we learned about the adoption itself. There was no record of it going through any official agency. No court documents, no social services involvement, no standard procedures that typically governed infant adoptions. Lisa had simply appeared in their lives through what Carol had described to neighbors as a private arrangement through the hospital. Pinewood General Hospital had facilitated the adoption directly, bypassing legal requirements and oversight that should have protected everyone involved. The more we investigated, the more obvious it became that Lisa's adoption had been completely off the books, arranged by people who had access to hospital records and newborn nurseries. On Monday morning, I was waiting at the bakery when Lisa arrived for her usual before-school visit. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested another difficult weekend at home. When she ordered her chocolate croissant, her usual enthusiasm was muted. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake of knowing I was talking to my stolen daughter. "My parents had another fight about college costs," she said, slumping against the counter. "Sometimes I wonder if they regret adopting me. I mean, they never expected to have to pay for college when they took in an infant." The casual way she spoke about being taken in, rather than chosen and cherished, broke my heart all over again. This beautiful, intelligent, caring girl had spent 16 years feeling like a burden rather than a blessing, never knowing that her real parents had wanted her desperately and mourned her loss every single day. "Lisa," I said carefully, "has anyone ever told you anything about your birth parents? Why they weren't able to keep you?" She shrugged, but I could see the pain the question caused. Mom and Dad said it was a teenage pregnancy, that the girl couldn't handle raising a baby. They said it was better for everyone if I didn't ask questions about it. Another lie. Another carefully constructed piece of misinformation designed to prevent Lisa from seeking the truth about her origins. I had been 25 when she was born, married, financially stable, and desperately wanting a child. There had been no teenage pregnancy, no girl who couldn't handle responsibility. There had been a mother who begged to see her baby and was told she was dead. "What if I told you that might not be the whole story?" I asked, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. Lisa looked up at me with sudden attention, those green eyes searching my face for meaning. "What do you mean?" I reached under the counter and pulled out the DNA test results, my hands trembling as I placed them in front of her. "I mean that sometimes the stories we're told aren't true. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us lie to us instead." She picked up the papers, reading slowly, her expression changing from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock. When she looked back at me, her voice was barely a whisper. "This says you're my mother." "I am your mother," I confirmed, tears streaming down my face. "I've been your mother for 16 years, Lisa. I just didn't know you were alive." The chocolate croissant fell from her hands, crumbling onto the bakery floor as she stared at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. "But my mom said my birth parents didn't want me. She said they gave me away because I was a mistake." "You were never a mistake," I said fiercely, moving around the counter to stand in front of her. "You were planned and wanted and loved before you were even born. I decorated a nursery for you. I picked out clothes and toys and books. Your father and I spent hours talking about what we would teach you, what kind of person you would become." "Then why did you give me away?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I didn't give you away, sweetheart. I was told you died during delivery. I held what I thought was your body. I buried what I believed was my baby girl. For 16 years, I visited your grave every month, wondering what you would have been like if you had lived." Lisa sank into one of the bakery chairs, the DNA results clutched in her shaking hands. "This can't be real. This is insane. Hospitals don't just fake babies. Deaths. People don't steal children and give them to other families." "But they did." I said gently, kneeling beside her chair. Someone at Pinewood General Hospital took you from me and gave you to Carol and Frank Grant. I don't know why yet, but I'm going to find out. The next hour was the most difficult conversation of my life. I explained everything I could remember about her birth, about Dr. Patricia Morse, about the strange delays and procedures that had prevented me from seeing her immediately. I told her about the funeral, about the years of grief counseling, about the way I had been drawn to her from the moment she walked into my bakery. Lisa listened with the stunned expression of someone whose entire understanding of their life was being systematically demolished. When I finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the DNA results. "So Carol and Frank aren't my parents," she finally said. "They're the people who raised you," I replied carefully. "They're the parents you've known. But David and I are your biological parents, and we never stopped wanting you." "David?" "My husband. Your father. He's been grieving for you just as long as I have." She looked around the bakery, taking in the warm lighting, the display cases full of pastries, the family photos on the counter that she had always admired. "This is so surreal. I've been coming here for months, feeling like this was the safest place in town, like you understood me better than my own parents. Now you're telling me you actually are my parent." "You felt safe here because this is where you belong," I said. "Some connections can't be broken, even by lies and deception." The bell above the bakery door chimed, and David walked in, having left school early to meet the daughter he thought had been dead for 16 years. Lisa looked up at him, and I watched his expression transform as he saw her face clearly for the first time, recognized the features that were unmistakably ours. "Oh my God," he whispered, tears immediately filling his eyes. "You have your mother's eyes." Lisa stood slowly, studying the man who was her father, searching his face for similarities and connections. "You really thought I was dead?" "We both did," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "We mourned you every day for 16 years. The three of us stood in the bakery, surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows, trying to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. This should have been a moment of pure joy, a family reunited against impossible odds. Instead, it was complicated by years of manipulation, by the knowledge that Lisa had another family who had raised her, and by the growing realization that someone was going to pay dearly for what they had done to all of us. "I need to understand how this happened," Lisa said, her voice stronger now, more determined. "I need to know who did this and why." "So do we," I replied. "And I promise you, we're going to find out everything. Every lie, every person involved, every reason they thought they could steal our child and get away with it." David pulled out his phone and began searching for attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice and fraud. I started making a list of everyone I could remember from that night at the hospital 16 years ago. Lisa sat between us, alternating between studying our faces and looking at the DNA results that had changed everything. "What happens now?" she asked. "I mean, I can't just leave Carol and Frank. They're the only parents I've ever known, even if they're not my biological parents." "We'll figure it out together," I assured her. "This is complicated and we're going to take it one step at a time. But Lisa, I want you to know that you're welcome here anytime, for any reason. This is your home too now." She nodded, though I could see the overwhelming nature of the situation in her expression. "I should probably get home. They'll wonder where I am." "Of course," I said, though every instinct screamed against letting her walk out that door. "But Lisa, will you come back tomorrow? We have a lot more to talk about." "Yeah," she said softly. "I'll come back." After she left, David and I sat in the empty bakery, holding hands across the small table where our daughter had just learned the truth about her identity. The joy of knowing she was alive was tempered by rage at what had been stolen from us and determination to make sure everyone responsible faced consequences. "We need to be careful," David said. "If someone was powerful enough to fake a baby's death and arrange an illegal adoption 16 years ago, they might be dangerous now if they think we're getting close to the truth." He was right. But I was beyond caring about personal safety. For 16 years I had lived with a grief so profound it had nearly destroyed me. I had celebrated birthdays at an empty grave, wondered what my daughter would have looked like, dreamed about conversations we would never have. Now I knew that while I was mourning, my baby girl was growing up 20 minutes away, feeling unwanted and uncertain about her place in the world. Someone was going to answer for that. Someone was going to pay for every tear I had cried, every sleepless night I had endured, every moment of joy they had stolen from our family. The investigation was just beginning, but I already knew it would lead to Pinewood General Hospital and the people who had betrayed the most fundamental trust between a mother and the medical system she depended on. What I didn't yet realize was that Lisa's case was just the tip of an iceberg, that Dr. Patricia Morse had been running an operation that affected dozens of families, and that the conspiracy reached much deeper into Clearwater Heights, power structure than I could possibly imagine. But I was about to find out, and when I did, there would be consequences that no one involved had prepared for. The attorney's office smelled like leather and old books, with heavy wooden furniture that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Tom Henderson sat across from David and me, his weathered face grave as he reviewed the documentation we had brought him. At 62, Henderson had built a reputation as the most tenacious medical malpractice lawyer in the state, the kind of man who took on cases that other attorneys considered impossible. In 35 years of practice, he said, setting down Lisa's DNA results, I've never seen anything quite like this. Medical fraud, yes. Adoption irregularities, certainly. But a coordinated conspiracy to fake an infant death and facilitate an illegal adoption? This is unprecedented. Henderson's initial investigation had already uncovered disturbing patterns at Pinewood General Hospital. Over the past 20 years, there had been an unusually high number of infant deaths during delivery, particularly in cases involving young, financially stable parents who had struggled with fertility issues. The statistical anomaly had never been investigated because each case appeared isolated, tragic but not suspicious on its surface. The genius of it, Henderson explained, pulling out a thick file folder, is that they targeted parents who were emotionally vulnerable and medically inexperienced. First-time mothers, couples who had undergone fertility treatments, families who were so grateful to finally be pregnant that they wouldn't question medical authority. The folder contained copies of medical records, death certificates, and adoption documents that Henderson had obtained through legal channels and private investigation. What emerged was a pattern that made my stomach churn with its calculated cruelty. Dr. Patricia Morse had been systematically identifying newborns with desirable characteristics, healthy babies born to parents who could provide loving homes, but lacked the social connections or legal knowledge to challenge medical determinations. These babies were declared dead after delivery, with falsified medical records supporting the claims of fatal complications. Meanwhile, Pinewood General Hospital maintained connections with wealthy couples who were willing to pay enormous sums for private adoptions with no questions asked. The babies were transferred directly from the delivery room to their new families, often leaving the hospital within hours of birth under false documentation. The financial aspect is staggering, Henderson continued, showing us bank records he had subpoenaed. Over the past 2 decades, we estimate that more than $3 million flowed through accounts connected to Dr. Morse and hospital administrator Catherine Webb. Each illegal adoption generated between $100,000 and $200,000 in payments. Catherine Webb. The name triggered a memory from that terrible night 16 years ago. She had been the woman in the expensive suit who appeared in my hospital room the morning after delivery, supposedly from the hospital's bereavement services. She had been the one who guided us through the paperwork, who recommended the funeral home, who had been so understanding about our need to handle everything quietly. Now I realized she had been managing the logistics of my daughter's disappearance while I was still sedating from surgery. How many families were affected? David asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. We've identified at least 37 cases over the past 20 years, Henderson replied. But Lisa's situation is unique because she was placed locally. Most of the stolen infants were transferred to families in other states to minimize the risk of accidental contact with their biological parents. The fact that Lisa had grown up 20 minutes away from us had been an oversight, a rare mistake in an otherwise carefully orchestrated operation. Dr. Morse had underestimated the power of maternal instinct and the possibility that a mother might recognize her own child despite years of believing she was dead. Henderson's investigator had also uncovered the reason Lisa had been placed with Carol and Frank Grant rather than a wealthy family out of state. Frank Grant was Catherine Webb's cousin, a man struggling with infertility issues in his own marriage. The placement had been personal rather than purely financial, a favor that had inadvertently kept our daughter close enough for fate to eventually reunite us. The key witness is going to be Sandra Mills, the nurse who was present during Lisa's delivery, Henderson explained. She left Pinewood General 3 years after the incident and has been working at Summit Medical Center ever since. My investigator spoke with her yesterday and she's agreed to meet with us. Sandra Mills. The woman who had tried to tell me something was wrong, who had offered to listen if I ever needed to talk about that night. She had been carrying the truth about my daughter for 13 years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. We met Sandra at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, far from Pinewood General Hospital and the colleagues who might recognize her. She looked older than I remembered, with stress lines around her eyes and graying hair that suggested the weight of secrets had taken its toll over the years. "Mrs. Thompson," she said as I approached her table, "I've been expecting this conversation for a long time." Sandra's account of that night was devastating in its detail. She had been present when Dr. Morse declared my daughter dead, had watched as the healthy, breathing infant was whisked away to a private room where Catherine Webb was waiting with paperwork that had been prepared in advance. "I knew something was wrong immediately," Sandra explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The baby was crying when they took her. Healthy babies don't cry after they're supposed to be dead." But Dr. Morse had complete authority in that delivery room, and when I questioned the procedures, she told me I was mistaken about what I had observed. The infant they showed me the next day had been a different baby entirely, one who had actually died during delivery to a mother who was under general anesthesia and never asked to see the body. The timing had been coordinated perfectly, with Dr. Morse managing both deliveries simultaneously to provide the deceased infant that would support her deception. "I tried to report it," Sandra continued, tears streaming down her face. "I went to the hospital administration, but Catherine Webb was the one who handled my complaint. She told me I was experiencing stress-related hallucinations, that the trauma of losing patients was affecting my judgment. When I persisted, she threatened my job, my nursing license, my ability to work anywhere in the healthcare system." Sandra had spent 13 years living with the knowledge that she had witnessed a crime but lacked the power or resources to expose it. She had watched other suspicious infant deaths occur, had seen other grieving mothers leave the hospital with empty arms while healthy babies disappeared into illegal adoptions. "Why are you willing to speak up now?" David asked. "Because I saw Lisa at the grocery store last month," Sandra replied. "She looks exactly like you, Mrs. Thompson. Exactly like the baby I saw breathing that night. I knew that if she was still living locally, eventually the truth would come out. I've been waiting for you to figure it out so I could finally tell someone what really happened." Sandra's testimony would be crucial, but Henderson warned us that prosecuting a case this old and this complex would require extensive evidence beyond witness accounts. Dr. Morse and Catherine Webb had covered their tracks carefully, and many of the hospital records from 16 years ago had been archived or destroyed through routine procedures. That's when Lisa surprised us all by volunteering to help with the investigation. She appeared at the bakery the next morning with a determination I hadn't seen before, carrying a backpack full of documents she had quietly gathered from her adoptive parents' house. "Carol keeps everything," Lisa explained, spreading papers across my counter. "Every document related to my adoption, every communication with the hospital, every piece of paperwork from the day they brought me home. The documents were a goldmine of evidence. Carol Grant had meticulously preserved letters from Catherine Webb, payment receipts for what were described as medical expenses and legal fees, and even photographs from the day they picked Lisa up at the hospital when she was less than 24 hours old. Most damaging was a handwritten note from Dr. Morse instructing the Grants to avoid any contact with hospital staff other than Catherine Webb, and to never discuss the details of the adoption with anyone, including Lisa herself. The note explicitly stated that the birth mother had specifically requested no contact, and that revealing any information about the biological parents could result in legal complications for the adoptive family. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a receipt dated the day after her birth. "They paid $15,000 to something called Riverside Medical Services. There's no company by that name registered in our county." Henderson's investigation revealed that Riverside Medical Services was a shell company established by Catherine Webb to process payments for the illegal adoptions. The money trail led to personal accounts belonging to Dr. Morse, Webb, and several other hospital employees who had been involved in the conspiracy. But the most shocking discovery came when we expanded our search to other families. Lisa had been using social media to connect with teenagers who had been born at Pinewood General Hospital around the same time, particularly those who had been adopted as infants. What she found was a network of young people who shared similar stories of private adoptions, missing birth records, and adoptive parents who discouraged questions about their origins. "There are dozens of us," Lisa reported during one of our evening meetings at the bakery. "Kids who were supposedly born to teenage mothers who couldn't keep them, or to families in crisis situations. But when you look at the details, none of the stories make sense. The timelines are wrong, the documentation is inconsistent, and we all have the same gaps in our early medical records." One of the teenagers Lisa had connected with was Marcus Wilson, a 17-year-old who had been adopted by a wealthy family in Pine Valley. Marcus had always been told his birth mother was a drug addict who died shortly after his birth, but his adoptive parents had paid nearly $200,000 for a private adoption that was supposed to have been arranged through legitimate channels. When Henderson obtained Marcus's hospital records, we discovered that his birth mother hadn't been a drug addict at all. She had been Angela Foster, a 23-year-old teacher who had been told her son died from sudden infant death syndrome during his first night in the hospital nursery. Angela had been living 30 miles away for 17 years, visiting her son's grave every year on his birthday, completely unaware that he was alive and thriving with another family. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Dr. Morse hadn't been stealing babies randomly. She had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that identified desirable infants, fabricated medical emergencies, and transferred the children to wealthy families, who paid enormous sums for the privilege of bypassing legal adoption procedures. Henderson estimated that over 2 decades, at least 50 families had been destroyed by the scheme. Biological parents had spent years grieving children who were alive, while adoptive families had unknowingly participated in a criminal conspiracy that could result in the loss of the children they had raised as their own. "The legal implications are unprecedented," Henderson explained during a meeting that included several other attorneys he had brought in to handle the complexity of the case. "We're talking about massive civil lawsuits against the hospital, criminal charges against multiple defendants, and family court proceedings to determine custody of children who have been living with illegal adoptive families for years." The criminal investigation was being led by Detective James Park, a specialist in healthcare fraud, who had been building a case against Pinewood General Hospital for other irregularities. Our evidence provided the breakthrough he had been seeking, but he warned us that prosecuting Dr. Morse would be challenging because she had been careful to maintain plausible medical justifications for her actions. "She's good at covering her tracks," Detective Park explained. "Every falsified death certificate includes genuine medical terminology and conditions that could theoretically cause infant death. Every illegal adoption was processed through shell companies that appear legitimate on the surface. We need evidence that shows deliberate intent to commit fraud, not just medical errors or procedural violations." That evidence came from an unexpected source. Catherine Webb's personal secretary, Maria Santos, had been keeping detailed records of all communications related to the illegal adoptions, ostensibly for business purposes but actually as insurance in case the conspiracy was ever exposed. Maria had grown increasingly uncomfortable with her role in the scheme over the years, particularly after witnessing the devastating effect on families who lost their children. When Detective Park approached her with immunity in exchange for cooperation, she provided a treasure trove of evidence that included recorded phone conversations, financial records, and documentation of payments to medical staff who had assisted with the falsifications. Dr. Morse was planning to retire next year, Maria revealed during a recorded interview. She wanted to complete a few more high-value adoptions to secure her retirement fund. She had a list of pregnant women who fit the target profile, and your daughter was at the top of that list. The target profile was chillingly specific. Dr. Morse had been identifying women who were first-time mothers with no family history of legal involvement, married couples with stable finances but limited social connections, and pregnancies that could be classified as high risk to justify intensive medical intervention. Lisa fit the profile perfectly. I had been 25, married to a teacher, financially stable but not wealthy, with no extended family in the area and no connections to the legal or medical communities that might have questioned Dr. Morse's decisions. My pregnancy had been complicated by mild gestational diabetes, providing the medical justification for extra monitoring and intervention that facilitated the deception. The evidence was overwhelming, but the human cost was devastating. As word of the investigation spread through the community, families began coming forward with their own stories of suspicious infant deaths and unexplained adoption procedures. The psychological trauma was profound, with biological parents experiencing a complex mix of joy at learning their children were alive and rage at the years of unnecessary grief they had endured. Equally traumatic was the impact on the adoptive families who had genuinely believed they were providing homes for children who needed them. Many had spent fortunes on what they thought were legitimate adoptions, had loved and raised children for years, and now faced the possibility of losing those children to their biological parents. Carol and Frank Grant were among the most affected. When Detective Park interviewed them as part of the criminal investigation, they broke down completely, admitting they had suspected something was wrong with Lisa's adoption, but had been too grateful for the opportunity to become parents to ask difficult questions. "We knew the price was too low, and the process was too fast," Carol sobbed during the interview. "But Catherine Webb assured us everything was legal, and we wanted a baby so desperately that we convinced ourselves not to worry about the details." Frank Grant's connection to Catherine Webb had made him a willing participant in what he now realized was criminal conspiracy, but his genuine love for Lisa was evident in every interaction. He had been a devoted father for 16 years, working extra shifts at the garage to pay for her school supplies and activities, never making her feel like a burden despite their financial struggles. The custody question was going to be the most complex aspect of the entire case. Lisa had spent 16 years with the Grants, had formed genuine emotional bonds with them, and considered them her parents, despite learning the truth about her biological origins. At the same time, David and I had never voluntarily given up our parental rights, had been victims of fraud, and had legal standing to reclaim custody of our daughter. Lisa herself was adamant that she didn't want the custody battle to destroy any of the relationships she had formed. "I want to know my biological parents," she told the family court mediator, "but I don't want to lose the parents who raised me. Can't I have both families?" The question highlighted the unprecedented nature of the case and the need for solutions that prioritized the well-being of the children who had been affected by Dr. Morse's criminal enterprise. Traditional custody law wasn't designed to handle situations where children had been stolen at birth and raised by unknowing accomplices to the crime. As the criminal case moved forward and the civil litigation expanded, the true scope of Dr. Patricia Morse's operation became clear. She had been running the most sophisticated baby-selling scheme in medical history, generating millions of dollars while destroying dozens of families and corrupting the fundamental trust between patients and healthcare providers. But even as we celebrated the progress of the investigation and the likelihood that Dr. Morse would face serious criminal charges, I knew the most difficult challenges still lay ahead. Proving the conspiracy was one thing. Rebuilding the relationships that had been destroyed by 16 years of lies would be quite another. The little girl I had mourned for so long was now a young woman with her own opinions, relationships, and life plans. Reconnecting with her meant navigating complex emotions, competing loyalties, and the reality that our family would never be what it might have been if the truth had never been hidden. Still, as I watched Lisa work alongside us to expose the conspiracy that had stolen her from us, I felt hopeful for the first time in 16 years. My daughter was not only alive, she was strong, intelligent, and determined to see justice done for all the families who had been affected by Dr. Morse's crimes. The woman who had stolen our daughter was about to learn that some bonds cannot be broken, even by the most elaborate deception. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source buried deep within Pinewood General Hospital's computer system. Detective Park's cybercrime unit had been analyzing years of electronic records when they discovered a hidden database that Catherine Webb had maintained separately from the hospital's official patient files. The database contained detailed profiles of hundreds of pregnant women who had been evaluated as potential targets for the baby selling operation. Each profile included personal information, financial status, family connections, social vulnerabilities, and most chilling of all, a rating system that classified mothers based on their likelihood to challenge medical authority. I stared at my own profile on Detective Park's laptop screen, feeling violated all over again. Catherine Webb had documented everything about David and me, from our teaching salaries to our lack of extended family in the area, from my trusting nature during medical appointments to David's tendency to defer to medical expertise. We had been studied, analyzed, and ultimately selected for victimization based on characteristics we had never imagined could be used against us. The profile rated me as an ideal candidate for the operation. Young, educated but not medically trained, financially stable but not wealthy enough to hire expensive lawyers, socially isolated due to our recent move to Clearwater Heights, and psychologically vulnerable due to previous miscarriages that had made me desperate to trust medical professionals completely. Most disturbing was a note dated 3 weeks before Lisa's birth, stating that Dr. Morse had already identified a buyer for our child. The prospective adoptive family had been selected, vetted, and prepared to receive a healthy infant with our specific genetic characteristics. Lisa's theft hadn't been a crime of opportunity. It had been planned months in advance. The buyer information led Detective Park to uncover the most shocking aspect of the entire conspiracy. Dr. Morse hadn't been selling babies to random wealthy families seeking quick adoptions. She had been running a sophisticated matching service that catered to extremely affluent clients who wanted to custom-order children with specific physical traits, intellectual potential, and genetic backgrounds. The database contained dozens of requests from prospective buyers who had provided detailed specifications for the children they wanted to purchase. Athletic ability, eye color, estimated intelligence based on parental education, artistic talents, and even personality traits were listed as desired characteristics. The buyers were willing to pay premium prices for babies who met their exact requirements. Lisa's files showed that she had been specifically requested by a family who wanted a daughter with green eyes, auburn hair, and parents with college educations. The requesting family had been willing to pay $300,000 for a child who matched their specifications exactly. Only a logistical error had resulted in her placement with the Grants instead of her intended buyers. The error had occurred because Catherine Webb's cousin Frank Grant had been pressuring her for months to help him and Carol adopt a child. When Lisa was born and designated for the high-paying buyers, Frank had shown up at the hospital unexpectedly, demanding to know when his promised adoption would be finalized. In a moment of family loyalty, Catherine had made the impulsive decision to give Lisa to the Grants instead of following through with the more lucrative arrangement. The wealthy buyers had been told that their requested child had died during delivery, and Catherine had refunded their money while promising to find another baby who met their specifications. They had never known that their purchased daughter was alive and living in poverty just 20 miles from their mansion in the exclusive Westfield neighborhood. Detective Park showed us photographs of the family who had originally purchased Lisa. Harrison and Victoria Blackwood lived in a sprawling estate with tennis courts, a private lake, and staff quarters for their domestic employees. Harrison was a pharmaceutical executive, and Victoria was a retired model who had been unable to conceive due to a genetic condition. They had been clients of Dr. Morse's operation for over 2 years, having previously purchased a son who is now 14 years old. The realization that Lisa had a biological brother living with another family was devastating. Detective Park's investigation revealed that Marcus had been stolen from his biological parents using the same methods, with his mother being told he had died from complications during a difficult delivery. His real parents, the Hendersons, lived in a small farming community 3 hours away, where they had been grieving their lost son for 14 years. The scope of Dr. Morse's operation was beyond anything we had imagined. She had been running multiple schemes simultaneously, from high-end custom baby purchases for wealthy clients to placement services for hospital employees, relatives like the Grants. Some stolen babies had been sold domestically, while others had been transferred to international buyers who wanted American children with specific characteristics. The international connections led Detective Park to coordinate with federal agencies, including the FBI and Interpol. Dr. Morse had been working with criminal organizations in several countries, facilitating illegal adoptions that generated millions of dollars in revenue. Some of the stolen children had been transported across international borders using falsified documentation that identified them as legitimate adoptees. The investigation revealed that Pinewood General Hospital had been the center of a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Clearwater Heights. Dr. Morse had been working with corrupt medical professionals in other states, sharing information about potential targets, and coordinating the logistics of baby trafficking on a national scale. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. Catherine Webb had been maintaining detailed records not just of successful thefts, but of planned operations that had been scheduled for the future. The database contained profiles of pregnant women who were currently receiving care at Pinewood General, women who had been selected as targets but whose babies hadn't been stolen yet. Among the pending cases was Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old woman who was 7 months pregnant with her first child. Jennifer had been classified as a high-priority target due to her youth, financial instability, and lack of family support. Her baby had already been promised to buyers who were willing to pay $400,000 for an infant, with Jennifer's specific genetic profile. Detective Park immediately coordinated with hospital security to protect Jennifer and other expectant mothers who had been identified as targets. Undercover officers were placed throughout Pinewood General's obstetrics ward, and all high-risk deliveries were monitored by law enforcement personnel to prevent additional thefts. The protection detail was implemented just in time. 3 days after Jennifer Walsh was placed under surveillance, she went into premature labor. Dr. Morse appeared in the delivery room despite not being assigned to Jennifer's case, claiming that the attending physician had requested her expertise due to complications. The undercover officers watched as Dr. Morse attempted to implement the same procedures she had used to steal Lisa 16 years earlier. She declared that the baby was in distress and needed immediate emergency intervention, then tried to remove the healthy infant from the delivery room using fabricated medical justifications. This time, however, law enforcement was prepared. Detective Park arrested Dr. Morse in the delivery room while she was holding Jennifer's newborn daughter, attempting to transfer the baby to Catherine Webb, who was waiting with falsified documentation in an adjacent room. The arrest was broadcast live on local news, with footage showing Dr. Morse being led away in handcuffs, while Jennifer Walsh held her healthy daughter safely in her arms. For the first time in over 20 years, Dr. Morse's criminal operation had been stopped in real time, preventing another family from experiencing the trauma that had destroyed so many others. The public revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the medical community and the broader public. Pinewood General Hospital was immediately placed under federal oversight, with all obstetrics procedures suspended pending a complete investigation of their practices. The hospital's board of directors faced criminal charges for their role in enabling the conspiracy, and the entire institution was at risk of losing its medical license. Media coverage of the story was extensive, with national news networks sending reporters to Clearwater Heights to interview affected families and experts in medical ethics. The case was described as the largest baby trafficking operation in American medical history, with implications that extended far beyond our small town. The publicity brought forward additional victims who had been living with their own unresolved grief and suspicions about their experiences at Pinewood General Hospital. Families from across the region contacted Detective Park's task force, reporting similar stories of infant deaths that had seemed suspicious but had never been investigated. Each new case added to the growing list of criminal charges against Dr. Morse and her accomplices. The conspiracy had been active for over 25 years, affecting more than 100 families and generating an estimated $10 million in illegal revenue. The financial trail led to offshore accounts, real estate investments, and luxury purchases that had been funded by the sale of stolen babies. Dr. Morse's arrest also revealed the psychological profile of a woman who had become completely detached from the human cost of her crimes. During interrogation, she showed no remorse for the families she had destroyed, instead expressing frustration that her operation had been discovered before she could complete her retirement plans. She had been planning to steal 5 more babies before ending her criminal career, with each theft generating enough money to secure her comfortable retirement in a country without extradition treaties with the United States. Her lack of empathy for the victims was so complete that even experienced law enforcement officials were disturbed by her callous attitude toward the destruction she had caused. Catherine Webb proved to be more cooperative, providing detailed information about the operation's logistics in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the extent of corruption within Pinewood General Hospital, implicating doctors, nurses, administrators, and support staff who had knowingly participated in the conspiracy. The hospital had essentially become a criminal organization disguised as a medical institution, with legitimate patient care serving as cover for an elaborate baby trafficking enterprise. Staff members who had questioned suspicious procedures had been transferred, terminated, or intimidated into silence, creating an environment where criminal activity could flourish unchecked. The legal proceedings were complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and types of charges ranging from kidnapping and fraud to racketeering and international trafficking. Dr. Morse faced potential life imprisonment, while her accomplices negotiated plea agreements that would result in substantial prison sentences and financial restitution. But the criminal justice process was only one aspect of addressing the damage that had been done. The affected families faced years of legal battles over custody, financial compensation, and the complex emotional work of rebuilding relationships that had been destroyed by decades of lies. Lisa's situation became a case study for family courts dealing with the unprecedented legal questions raised by the conspiracy. She had spent 16 years with the Grants, forming genuine emotional bonds that couldn't simply be dissolved because her adoption had been illegal. At the same time, David and I had never voluntarily relinquished our parental rights and had been victims of criminal fraud. The court appointed a team of child psychologists and family therapists to help navigate the complex emotions involved in Lisa's reintegration with her biological family, while maintaining her relationship with the people who had raised her. The process was difficult for everyone involved, requiring careful balance between legal rights and emotional well-being. Lisa herself showed remarkable maturity in handling the situation, advocating for a solution that would allow her to maintain relationships with both families while gradually transitioning to spending more time with David and me. She had inherited my determination and David's analytical thinking, qualities that helped her navigate the complex emotions and competing loyalties she faced. The custody arrangement that eventually emerged was unconventional, but reflected the unique circumstances of our case. Lisa would continue living with the Grants during her final year of high school, but would spend increasing amounts of time with David and me as she prepared for college. Legal custody would be shared between all 4 parents, with decisions made collaboratively in Lisa's best interests. Financial restitution was another complex issue. The families who had lost children were entitled to substantial damages for the emotional trauma and lost years they had experienced. The adoptive families who had unknowingly purchased stolen babies faced the loss of their life savings and potential criminal charges for their involvement in the conspiracy. A victim compensation fund was established using assets seized from Dr. Morse and her accomplices, but the amount of money involved could never adequately address the scope of the damage that had been done. Some families had been destroyed by grief, others by the financial strain of infertility treatments and illegal adoption fees, and still others by the trauma of learning that their entire family structure had been built on criminal activity. The psychological impact on the stolen children themselves was profound. Many were teenagers or young adults who had to confront the reality that their entire life story had been based on lies, that their adoptive parents had unknowingly participated in criminal activity, and that their biological parents had been grieving their supposed deaths for years. Support groups were established to help these young people process their complex emotions and navigate the challenging relationships with multiple sets of parents. The therapeutic work was ongoing and would likely continue for years as the full psychological impact of the conspiracy became clear. For David and me, the process of rebuilding our relationship with Lisa was both joyful and painful. We had missed 16 years of her life, from first steps and first words to school plays and birthday parties. Those lost years could never be recovered, but we were determined to make the most of the time we had left before she left for college. Lisa had grown into a remarkable young woman despite the circumstances of her upbringing. She was intelligent, compassionate, and strong-willed, with interests in social justice and healthcare reform that had been shaped by her experience as a victim of medical corruption. She had decided to study pre-law in college with the goal of becoming an attorney who specialized in medical malpractice and patient rights. The investigation had also revealed information about the family who had originally purchased Lisa. Harrison and Victoria Blackwood faced their own legal challenges as evidence emerged of their knowing participation in illegal adoption practices. They had been aware that Dr. Morse's services circumvented legal adoption procedures, had paid premium prices for that circumvention, and had purchased multiple children through the same criminal network. Their son Marcus, who was Lisa's biological brother, was also struggling with the revelation that his entire identity had been built on criminal fraud. The Blackwoods had told him he was adopted, but they had led him to believe his biological parents had voluntarily given him up due to drug addiction and financial problems. Learning that his real parents were successful farmers who had been devastated by his supposed death was traumatic for Marcus, who had to reconcile his privileged upbringing with the knowledge that it had been purchased through criminal activity. His biological parents, the Hendersons, had been searching for answers about their son's death for 14 years, visiting his grave monthly and wondering what they had done wrong to lose their child. The reunion between Marcus and the Hendersons was even more complex than Lisa's situation, because Marcus had been raised with wealth and privilege that his biological parents couldn't provide. He struggled with guilt about the advantages he had received through criminal activity and anger at the lies he had been told about his origins. The ripple effects of Dr. Morse's conspiracy continued to expand as more families came forward and additional evidence emerged. Each new revelation added to the growing understanding of how deeply the corruption had penetrated the medical system and how many lives had been destroyed by the greed and callousness of a small group of criminals who had exploited the most vulnerable moments in people's lives. The case had become a national symbol of the need for stronger oversight of medical institutions and adoption practices. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine how such a widespread criminal conspiracy could operate undetected for over 2 decades, and new legislation was being drafted to prevent similar crimes in the future. But for all the families who had been affected, the legal and policy responses were secondary to the personal work of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by betrayal and deception. The healing process would take years, and some relationships would never fully recover from the damage that had been done. As I watched Lisa work on her college applications in my bakery after school, I felt a complex mix of emotions that I was still learning to navigate. Joy at having my daughter back, rage at the years that had been stolen from us, hope for the future we could build together, and determination to ensure that Dr. Morse and her accomplices faced the full consequences of their crimes. The woman who had stolen my baby was about to learn that some bonds are stronger than any deception, and that a mother's love can survive even the cruelest betrayal. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning of Dr. Patricia Morse's sentencing. I sat in the front row between David and Lisa, surrounded by dozens of other families whose lives had been destroyed by the conspiracy. The media attention had been overwhelming, with reporters from national networks documenting every aspect of the legal proceedings that would determine whether justice could truly be served for crimes so heinous they challenged the limits of the legal system. Judge Margaret Caldwell had presided over the complex case for 8 months, navigating unprecedented legal questions about medical fraud, child trafficking, and the rights of families torn apart by criminal deception. She was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her commitment to ensuring that sentences reflected the true scope of crimes committed, regardless of the defendant's social status or professional reputation. Dr. Morse sat at the defendant's table looking remarkably composed for a woman facing multiple life sentences. Her defense team had attempted to portray her as a dedicated physician whose good intentions had been corrupted by financial pressures and the demands of wealthy clients. They argued that she had genuinely believed she was helping infertile couples build families while providing better opportunities for children who might otherwise face difficult circumstances. The prosecution had systematically dismantled those arguments over months of testimony that revealed the calculated nature of Dr. Morse's crimes. She hadn't been helping anyone except herself, generating millions of dollars through the systematic theft of healthy babies from loving parents who desperately wanted their children. Catherine Webb had already been sentenced to 25 years in prison after cooperating fully with investigators. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the scope of the conspiracy and identifying all the participants involved in the criminal enterprise. She had broken down completely during her own sentencing, sobbing as she apologized to the families she had helped destroy through her greed and corruption. The impact statements from affected families took nearly 3 hours to present. Parents described the devastating grief they had endured, the marriages that had been destroyed by loss, the years of therapy and medication required to cope with trauma that had been manufactured by criminals they had trusted with their most vulnerable moments. Angela Foster spoke about the 14 years she had spent visiting her son Marcus's grave, bringing birthday presents and Christmas ornaments to a cemetery plot that contained a stranger's remains, while her living child grew up with kidnappers who had purchased him like merchandise. Her voice broke as she described the father-son fishing trips she had missed, the school plays she had never attended, the conversations about life and values that had been stolen from both of them. Carol and Frank Grant had been given immunity in exchange for their cooperation, but they also addressed the court to describe their own victimization by the conspiracy. They had genuinely believed they were adopting a child whose birth mother couldn't provide adequate care, and they had loved Lisa with complete devotion for 16 years. Learning that their daughter had been stolen from parents who wanted her had been devastating, filling them with guilt and grief that would affect them for the rest of their lives. When my turn came to address the court, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 16 years of grief and the hope of justice finally being served. I looked directly at Dr. Morse as I spoke, wanting her to see the face of the woman whose life she had destroyed through her calculated cruelty. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "Dr. Patricia Morse didn't just steal my baby. She stole my identity as a mother, my husband's joy in fatherhood, and our daughter's right to grow up with the parents who created her out of love rather than financial transaction." I described the years of grief counseling, the antidepressants that had become necessary for basic functioning, the strain on my marriage that had nearly ended our relationship multiple times as we struggled to cope with loss that we now knew had been manufactured for profit. I spoke about the monthly visits to an empty grave, the birthday cakes I had baked for a daughter I thought was dead, the Christmas presents I had donated to charity in her memory while she was living in poverty 20 minutes away. "The cruelest aspect of your crimes," I continued, addressing Dr. Morse directly, "is that you robbed us of 16 years of our daughter's childhood, while simultaneously depriving her of the love and opportunities she deserved. You didn't help anyone except yourself, and you destroyed countless lives in the process." Lisa had chosen to speak as well, representing not just her own experience, but the perspectives of all the stolen children who had been affected by the conspiracy. At 17, she possessed a maturity and eloquence that commanded the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "Dr. Morse," she said, standing tall and speaking with confidence that belied her age, "you made me an orphan while my parents were alive. You made my parents childless while their daughter was living and breathing just miles away. Your crimes didn't just affect one moment in time. They poisoned every day of our lives for 16 years. She described growing up feeling unwanted and burdensome, sensing that something fundamental was wrong with her identity, but lacking the information needed to understand why. She spoke about the instant connection she had felt with me at the bakery, the inexplicable sense of belonging that she now understood had been the recognition of maternal love that had been denied to both of us. I spent my childhood wondering why I felt so different from my adoptive parents, why I looked like no one in my family, why I had interests and talents that seemed to come from nowhere, Lisa explained. Now I know it's because I was living with strangers while my real family was grieving my supposed death. You stole my childhood, my identity, and my sense of belonging in the world. The prosecution's final arguments emphasized the unprecedented nature of Dr. Morse's crimes, and the need for sentences that would deter others from attempting similar conspiracies. The federal charges included racketeering, conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, kidnapping, and violations of international trafficking laws. Each charge carried substantial prison time, and the prosecution was seeking consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. Dr. Morse's defense made a final plea for leniency, arguing that she was a first-time offender who had dedicated her career to helping families and had been corrupted by circumstances beyond her control. They requested concurrent sentences and consideration for her advanced age, claiming that life imprisonment would be tantamount to a death sentence for a woman in her 70s. Judge Caldwell deliberated for 2 days before returning to deliver her sentence. The courtroom was silent as she addressed Dr. Morse directly, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority that comes from presiding over cases that challenge fundamental assumptions about human decency. "Dr. Morse," Judge Caldwell began, "in 30 years on the bench I have never encountered crimes that demonstrate such calculated cruelty combined with such profound betrayal of professional trust. You held yourself out as a healer while systematically destroying families for personal profit. You exploited the most vulnerable moments in people's lives, turning their joy into manufactured grief, while selling their children to the highest bidder. The judge methodically addressed each charge, imposing sentences that reflected the full scope of Dr. Morse's criminal enterprise. The kidnapping charges alone resulted in multiple life sentences, while the racketeering and fraud convictions added additional decades of imprisonment. The sentences would run consecutively, ensuring that Dr. Morse would spend the rest of her life in federal prison. Your crimes have created trauma that will affect multiple generations of families, Judge Caldwell continued. The children you stole will struggle with identity issues for the rest of their lives. The parents you deceived have lost years of their children's development that can never be recovered. The adoptive families who unknowingly participated in your conspiracy face their own complex trauma and legal challenges. The final sentence totaled 4 consecutive life terms plus 85 years, with no possibility of parole. Dr. Morse showed no emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining the cold composure that had characterized her throughout the trial. She was immediately remanded to federal custody, where she would remain until her death. Catherine Webb and other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, with requirements for substantial financial restitution to the affected families. The civil lawsuits against Pinewood General Hospital and its board of directors resulted in a settlement fund exceeding $50 million, providing some measure of financial compensation for the families who had been victimized. But the legal resolution was only the beginning of the healing process for families like ours. The complex work of rebuilding relationships and processing trauma would continue for years, requiring ongoing therapy and careful navigation of competing emotions and loyalties. Lisa's transition between her two families had been handled with remarkable grace by everyone involved. She had maintained her close relationship with Carol and Frank Grant, while gradually spending more time with David and me. The arrangement required constant communication and compromise, but it reflected the reality that Lisa's identity had been shaped by 16 years with one family while her biological connection belonged to another. College provided a natural opportunity for Lisa to establish some independence while maintaining relationships with both sets of parents. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarships, partly due to her academic achievements, and partly due to the national attention her story had received. She chose to attend a school 3 hours away, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to provide the space she needed to develop her own identity. Her decision to study pre-law had been influenced by her experience with the legal system and her desire to advocate for other families who might face similar crises. She had already been accepted into a summer internship program with a law firm that specialized in medical malpractice, and she planned to focus her career on healthcare ethics and patient rights. David and I had also made significant changes in our lives following the revelation of the conspiracy. I had expanded my bakery into a larger space and hired additional staff, allowing me to focus more time on victim advocacy work with other families affected by medical fraud. The experience had taught me the importance of questioning medical authority when something doesn't feel right, and I wanted to help other patients navigate complex medical systems with greater confidence. David had taken a leave of absence from his principal position to write a book about our family's experience and the broader implications of the Pinewood General Hospital conspiracy. His goal was to educate other families about warning signs of medical fraud while advocating for stronger oversight of healthcare institutions. The ripple effects of the case continued to influence policy and practice in medical communities across the country. Congressional hearings had resulted in new legislation requiring additional oversight of hospital obstetrics departments and mandatory reporting of infant deaths. The American Medical Association had implemented new ethical guidelines for physicians involved in adoption procedures, and medical schools had added coursework on recognizing and preventing healthcare fraud. Marcus Henderson had also thrived despite the trauma of learning about his stolen identity. His reunion with his biological parents had been complicated by the vast differences in their economic circumstances and life experiences, but the fundamental love between them had provided a foundation for rebuilding their relationship. He had chosen to keep the surname Henderson while maintaining contact with the Blackwoods, who faced their own legal challenges related to their knowing participation in illegal adoptions. The support group that had been established for stolen children and their families had grown into a national organization providing resources for others who discovered similar circumstances in their own backgrounds. Lisa had become one of the organization's most effective advocates, speaking at conferences and working with lawmakers to strengthen protections for vulnerable families. The investigation had also led to discoveries of similar conspiracies at other hospitals across the country. Dr. Morse's network had extended far beyond Pinewood General, and law enforcement agencies were continuing to investigate related criminal activity in multiple states. Additional families were still coming forward with their own stories of suspicious circumstances surrounding infant deaths and adoptions. 2 years after Dr. Morse's sentencing, Lisa graduated from high school as valedictorian, with both sets of parents in attendance at the ceremony. Her speech focused on the importance of truth, resilience, and the power of love to survive even the most devastating deception. She received a standing ovation from the entire audience, many of whom had followed our family's story in the local media. The graduation party was held at my bakery, with Lisa's friends from school mixing easily with family members from both sides of her complex family tree. Carol Grant had helped me bake Lisa's favorite chocolate cake, while Frank Grant and David discussed Lisa's college plans and their shared pride in her achievements. Watching Lisa surrounded by people who loved her, I felt a complex mix of emotions that had become familiar over the past few years. Gratitude for having her back in our lives, sadness for the years we had missed, and determination to make the most of every moment we had together moving forward. The healing process hadn't been linear or simple. There had been difficult conversations, painful realizations, and moments when the weight of what had been stolen from us felt overwhelming. But there had also been unexpected joys, new traditions, and the gradual building of relationships that were stronger for having survived such extraordinary challenges. Lisa had taught us that resilience could emerge from the most devastating circumstances, that love could survive even the cruelest deception, and that truth, no matter how painful, was always preferable to lies that seemed more comfortable. Dr. Patricia Morse had believed she could profit from the destruction of families without facing consequences for her actions. She had underestimated the power of maternal love, the determination of victims seeking justice, and the resilience of children who refused to be defined by the circumstances of their theft. As Lisa prepared to leave for college, carrying with her the love of 4 parents who had supported her through the most challenging period of her life, I knew that Dr. Morse's legacy would ultimately be one of failure. She had tried to destroy our family, but instead she had made us stronger. She had thought she could profit from our pain, but she had only succeeded in teaching us the true value of the relationships that mattered most. The empty grave at Mountain View Cemetery had finally been filled with a proper memorial, not to a dead child, but to the grief that had been manufactured through criminal deception. The inscription read, "In memory of the years stolen by lies, in celebration of the love that survived truth." Lisa visited the memorial with me on the anniversary of her birth, bringing flowers that represented both the sadness of our separation and the joy of our reunion. Standing together at the place where I had mourned her for so many years, we talked about the future we would build together, the past we had lost, and the strength we had discovered in each other. The woman who had stolen my baby was spending her remaining years in a federal prison cell, her medical license permanently revoked, her reputation destroyed, her criminal enterprise dismantled. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and our family had been restored. But most importantly, my daughter was alive, thriving, and surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. Dr. Patricia Morse had taken 16 years from us, but she couldn't take away the lifetime we had ahead of us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.